So I have to out myself in this crowd. I'm a philosopher, but I'm one of those people who has a really hard time with the subject of the conference because, as I said already yesterday in my comments to Michael, I actually think until now that we haven't actually found a better institutional setup than the nation state to make sure that people have the means to lead good lives, right? So what we mean by this is normally that people have access to education, that people have access to medical care, and that people have, in general, the means and ways to determine how they want to lead their lives. Right? So this is what we normally talk about when we talk about autonomy. So you need to know that about me. And you also need to know that I agree that there is a problem when we look simply at the statistics with the distribution of doctors. So we have, I think, in Canada, some ridiculous distribution. Obviously, these are national distributional patterns. So we have, I think, some 30 doctors per 1,000 people in the urban centers, a little bit less in the less urban centers, and then it's a huge problem in the north. But overall, from a national perspective, we have a relative safe distribution of doctors. If we go to some other countries, we have a much less favorable distribution of doctors. And we can debate whether or not distribution of doctors is really due to the fact that some people leave, some medical practitioners leave these countries. But in principle, I think that inequality in redistribution is a problem that we should think about. Okay. So, nevertheless, here I am going to propose a paper that is critical about the idea that we can impose exit restrictions on individual migrants based on a concern for social justice. I'm not against social justice. I'm just trying to balance two things here, and this is very important. I'm trying to balance the capacity of the state, which, as I said, is until now the best means we have to afford people with access to the means of being autonomous, with the idea of individual autonomy, which is something that Michael has been very forceful in defending, that people should just be able to decide for themselves where they want to live and how they want to go about their lives. And the title that I found for this idea is Are They My Skills, which is a variation of a subject that was originally brought about by Emerson, who is an American romantic, who wrote at length about the idea of self-reliance. And Emerson, at some point in this treaty on self-reliance, says, are they my poor? And he wants to explain that he shouldn't assume a responsibility for those who are not able to fend for themselves, right? So for the non-Americans among us, I'm not American, just so you know, this is something that is quite intriguing, but at the same time very typical American, right? Because self-reliance is something that the American people stand for. But the idea here, in my variation on the theme, is that we want to say, well, we have this idea of self-reliance of the state, we have this idea of self-determination. So I want to say, but does that allow me to use the skilled people of my country for my purposes as the state? Or, is there something else going on? Okay, so we have a problem, we have this problem, as I said, of provision of social justice, and we have the problem of allowing people to be individually autonomous, right? And in the literature, in philosophical literature, there's been a lot of debate about brain drain, and I'm going to stick with that term, for better and worse. I'm conscious of the discussion we've had yesterday, and I'm not trying to not accept that brain drain is a problematic terminology, but for lack of a better signifier, I'm going to stick with brain drain. So there has been a lot of discussion about brain drain in the literature, and analytic philosophers do what they do best. They read somebody's argument, and then they find this tiny little thing that they get really excited about, and they think, oh, I can say something to that. So this is what's going on here. So all the non-philosophers have to bear with me. I'm going to try and make it palatable to the non-philosophers. So what I want to say is that there are two among the many propositions, there are two propositions out there that try to balance this individual autonomy versus social justice problem by making two suggestions. One is that if it is a question of supporting the institutions of social justice, then we may actually say that we can impose exit restrictions on people with high skills. So I'm going to focus on medical migration. but you can extrapolate from what I'm saying to other professions. So the idea being that in order to support institutions of social justice, which should allow exit restrictions, and the exit restriction that is most often debated is mandatory service for medical graduates, right? So we allow them to get educated in the country of origin, but before they're allowed to leave, we ask them to serve in the country. We may even ask them to serve in a specific region. So one of the proposals that is highly discussed right now is apparently Ghana has adopted a policy where they only give their nursing graduates their nursing certificates after they have worked in the country for 5 years, right? So these women can't even leave if they wanted to unless they find somebody who believes that they actually are nurses, because Ghana just won't give them the nursing certificate. So this is the kind of thing that I'm thinking about, okay? So that's the first argument, most prominently proposed by a woman called Gillian Brock. And she says, we can find good reasons why this is a justifiable policy. The other argument, which is maybe a bit more radical, is to say, well, we don't need to justify it through the institutions of social justice. We can simply rethink this idea that we have in liberal societies, that we're not allowed to restrict freedom of occupational choice. This is an argument proposed by a philosopher called Lukács Stancik, who calls it productive justice. And he says, if we're really interested in a fair distribution of labor and a fair distribution of labor outcomes in our societies, why do we stick to this idea that the state should not intervene at all in people's occupational choices? We should be allowed to tell people who have a skill that they have to serve the needy, at least for a certain period of time. That's the second point that I'm going to come to. Okay, so there is another argument that I'm not going to talk about, which is a kind of reciprocity argument, right? So here the idea is, well, and we've talked about this a little bit yesterday, you have gone through the educational system, you have benefited from it. The lady who was sitting in front here said in response to Michael's presentation, well, it's not just that university education is what qualifies people, it's primary education, etc., etc. So all the institutions of the state make you to the person who you are, and you should have an obligation of reciprocity, which is you should be giving something back, right? You shouldn't be allowed to free ride on the institutions that your state provides you with. Instead, you should have an obligation to pay back. And I'm leaving that aside because the reciprocity argument only gets you that far, right? So it's highly debated in the literature. It was always proposed by John Rawls as one of the fundamental tenets of liberal justice, that we have a sense of reciprocity. But the debate, most prominently proposed by Brian Barry, has kind of shown that reciprocity only gets us that far, because very often those people who are in most need of access to institutions of social justice are not the ones who can contribute effectively, right? So think about severely disabled people or mentally disabled people. They need care or they need access to provisions, but they're not necessarily the ones who are going to contribute to society, so that we say, well, this is basically reciprocity. So reciprocity is often described as the theory of mutual advantage, and I'm leaving this aside because I don't think it gets us so far. Okay, so let's talk about Brock. So Gillian Brock says, and I think most political philosophers accept this, that we have a duty of justice to contribute to the promotion of social justice. And one of the tools to promote social justice are the institutions of social justice. So, philosophers often talk about duties, you don't have to get worried about it, it's totally innocuous, so to speak. The idea simply is that if we can make the world a better place, then we have a duty to do this. It's remarkably similar to the duty to not do harm, right? So we can then have a discussion for the philosophers in the room, whether it's positive or negative, but that's not the deal. Now, one of the important things about this is that it's meant to promote individual autonomy, because as I said in my title, I'm a liberal and I'm concerned that people like Michael have the means to decide for themselves what kind of lives they want to lead. Okay, so one of the ways that we as societies have developed promote these goals of justice is that we have institutions like the welfare state, we have medical access to medical services, we have education, and so on and so forth. And the idea then is that all of us have this duty to promote justice in our societies, right? And we do this by supporting institutions. So as soon as we realize that the institutions suffer from a certain behavior, we have an obligation to make sure that they don't, right? And so if the idea is that medical services, the institution of medical provision suffers because there's a social trend in society, then as a society we should have permission to make sure that these institutions endure over time, right? As I say, it's not immediately problematic because the ultimate concern is the promotion of social justice. Okay, so what I want to put into question is that we have an obligation to support the institutions of social justice in our country of origin. And so this is where the appropriation aspect comes in, right? So imagine a case where somebody says, well, I really believe in the institution of social justice, right? And I, for some curiosity in my life, have developed a medical skill and I'm really good at doing something that is life-saving. But I don't really see the need to exercise my skills in my country of origin. So imagine the doctor from Kenya who decides, instead of the stereotypical migration pattern, instead of moving to the States, that person decides to move to Malawi. And we talked about Malawi, right? It's a bad country in terms of medical standards. And so this person says, no, I'm going to apply my skills in Malawi, and I'm going to promote the institution of social justice in Malawi. I find it very difficult to say to that person, oh no, but you have a duty of justice to satisfy your obligations in your country of origin, right? So unless we have some other story that is a non-liberal story from my perspective, and this is why I can somewhat claim that I have actually satisfied the requirement of the conference, which is thinking about methodological nationalism, unless we have a claim about the moral precedence over our compatriots over those of other people, we can't justify that we restrict people from serving the institutions of social justice elsewhere. Right? So yesterday, in response to Oliveira's paper, I said, well, what about the person who wants to move to Canada but serve in Aboriginal communities, right? This is really what we need, doctors. How can I say to that person, no, you can't leave Kenya because really you have to serve the people in Kenya. Now we can have a kind of discussion about the relative inequality of health standards between Aboriginal people in Canada and people in Kenya. But that's not what people like Jane Brock say. They just say we have a duty of social justice and we have to further the institutions of social justice. So I can't say to the person who wants to go in to work in Aboriginal communities or in Malawi, can't do it, have to stay in Kenya, unless a national story is going on. Right? So that's my first comment. Moreover, and this is also something that is driving this whole discussion, remember that one of the motivations for people to come up with these exit restrictions is to say, well, we have this really unfair distribution of doctors, right? So if I then say to somebody who wants to go to Malawi from Kenya, well, you can't go to Malawi because you have to help the Kenyans, that person would in effect obviously help a health-deprived country because Malawi is even worse off than Kenya, right? So it's to me, it's incoherent to say to somebody like that, well, you might be helping the overall redistribution of medical practitioners on a global scale, but since the social needs, the social justice needs and concerns of your compatriots take precedence, you have to stay in your country of origin. That seems to me implausible. Now, of course, people have anticipated this. I'm not very original in saying this. And somebody says, well, hang on. We're not talking about social justice in general. We're talking about health. Like, if you don't have health, everything else doesn't matter, right? So some people say, well, health is really special. And because it's so special, we shouldn't think of it in terms of providing rights. We should think of it in terms of an emergency. Like we're having a health emergency. If you look at the literature, it's full of that kind of stuff, and language, right? The health emergency in developing countries, etc., etc. The WHO is like the prime suspect in this kind of publication. Okay, let's think about that. So some people say it's not a question of just simply allowing people access to social goods, it's a health emergency. Here I want to say, fair enough, it's true. I mean, the under 5 mortality rate in some countries is enormous, and we can, I think, plausibly say it's a health emergency. But does that say anything, does that tell us anything about our obligations of justice? Because if it's a health emergency, Again, why are we restricted in recruiting compatriots? So imagine the Japanese tourist who is in Kenya or in Malawi, for whatever reason she wanted to go to Malawi for holidaying. And if we kept her in the country for 6 months, she could save unnumbered Malawians by just simply being put to work in a Malawi hospital. Why can't we say to that person, no, hang on, we're not restricting your liberty unduly, we're only asking you to stay here for 6 months. And then after 6 months you can go back to Japan, your life will be proceeding as you had planned it, no major intervention, right? Just stay for a little while. We can't pay you that much, but you're doing much good. Why can we never fathom to do that, but we could fathom to do it to compatriots, right? So so it seems to me that unless we want to claim that the emergency argument for health gives us that kind of right to conscript everybody to help us address the emergency, then it doesn't justify that we conscript compatriots to do the same thing. So this is my argument. Okay, so you want to be very careful about the emergency thing. There's another argument you want to be careful about the emergency reasoning, which is that emergency claims have a very specific nature, which was recently published in a paper by Jennifer Rubenstein. And I think this is really insightful because she says, when you make an emergency claim, what you're claiming is that there's a status quo ante that you want to get back to, right? So you have a situation that is deviant from the status quo ante, and the status quo ante is sustainable. So the emergency claim really always says, let's do something quickly so that we can get back to the situation. And I don't think anybody wants to say that Malawi has had health sufficiency in the next, many, many years. Okay. So, and then finally, in order to address Brock's argument, I say, well, so we say that it's not clear why we have to support the institutions at home, and we can't really say, well, it's an emergency. And moreover, it seems to me that the institutional argument is a very specific logic, which is normally when we talk about the institutions of the social welfare state, we assume that there is consent among the people who benefit from it, and not only the people who benefit from it, but also the people who are living under these institutions, because they have to support them, right? So you have to consent to the institutions of the social welfare state because you will then be taxed to support them, right? So this is the kind of argument that we have to be able to justify what our institutions do to us in order to compensate for this so-called coercion that goes on in the social welfare state, right? This is an argument that was proposed by Michael Blake, where he says, well, we take your money, but in exchange for the coercion happening when taking your money, we'll give you something back, and that's how we justify it, right? So somehow we have to tell a story about why these institutions are good institutions, and you have to buy this story. Now, what happens is, if somebody moves, so let's say somebody doesn't move to the States, but a medical practitioner moves, and this is actually a problem that we have now. It's called, again, brain drain. I know you don't like it, but it's called internal brain drain, or brain drain towards NGOs and humanitarian organizations. What we have here is the same problem. The state is still not able to use people who were trained in the system of the state for its purposes, but instead medical practitioners decide that it is better for what they want to do to join NGOs, because NGOs like Médecins Sans Frontières may be a more effective way of actually providing healthcare, right? So the problem for the state is the same thing. We still don't have access to our medical practitioners. But you basically say, what Brock and those people who propose exit restrictions want to say is, no, but you have to stay here because our institutions are good and you have to buy this story. And that person says, no, I don't buy your story. Médecins Sans Frontières is a much better institution to do what I want to do and what you say you want to do, right? So there's a kind of justifiability problem when people decide to leave the institutions of the state as the best institutions. But at the same time, we say, in political theory or in political philosophy, we say, well, but you have to be able to justify your institutions. So if there's a brain drain, we can say the institutions are just no longer justifiable. And so they lose somewhat of their normative force to coerce us to do what we're supposed to do. Right? So this is the other argument I have to say to Brock. Now let's go to this other crazy argument, which is Lukas Danzig's argument of, well, it's not crazy, obviously, but about productive justice. And so here I'll go. Sorry? his name is Stanzik. I'll send you the article. So I'll go through this more quickly because this is a really kind of in-house debate for crazy political philosophers. So he says, okay, the liberal state has kind of 3 tenets, and these 3 tenets don't work together, and we have to do something about that because if we keep sticking to them, we just have a problem of plausibility, and we can't really explain anything. So we say, justice doesn't constrain directly occupational choice. So that's one of the things that the liberal state believes in. The other thing is justice forbids forcibly assigning jobs except where liberties are at risk, right? So, Eastern Germany under the GDR was famous for this. Well, you can't really become an engineer, but you could become like an agricultural laborer, right? We need agricultural laborers, so you should do that. So we don't buy this as liberals, because obviously, if you choose a profession, that's part, supposedly, of your individual autonomy. Through the profession that you choose, you express yourself, and you can be the person you want to be, right? So we don't directly assign occupational choice, except in cases of conscription, and this is important, right? So when somebody stands at our borders and says, oh, we're going to invade you because we're going to make you a communist country, then very often people say, well, we might need all the citizens we can get in order to defend ourselves, right? So the idea here is, and this goes back to Kant, in order to protect your basic liberties, the state is allowed to restrict your basic liberties to protect them, right? But except for that, there's no other reason why we might why we might assign jobs. And finally, Stanzik says, the third tenet that the liberal state believes in is justice requires society to ensure more than merely liberties, right? So he says we have to give one of those 3 up because they don't work together. And we can't give up 3 because then, justice requires society to ensure more than merely liberties. I think everybody would agree that's not just a question of being free, right? We need something else going on in order to say that we live in a just society. So we have to deal with either 1 or 2. And he's saying, okay, well, we don't want to constrain occupational choice, but we should be thinking about assigning duties or assigning jobs, or more, the way he phrases it, we should be allowed as the liberal state to justify, to make people work for a certain period of time in order to satisfy the needs of individual members of the society, right? So he basically comes to the conclusion that we have 4 options and we should choose one of them, which is to say that justice requires society to be able to employ people in order to satisfy access to social justice needs. And here I'd say very quickly, well, and he justifies it and says, well, actually it's not really restricting freedom of occupation because we allow them to be the person they want to be. If they don't want to work, so if we say to people, and this is also something that Michael talked about yesterday, and I bit my tongue. If we say to people, okay, before you start medical education, you have to sign this contract here where it says that after graduation you will have to serve in your country for 5 years. He says, well, that's not actually coercion. Like, we're allowing people to choose. We're just making a conditional choice, right? So it's not really coercion. Here I think, well, let's think about this. He says, if somebody doesn't want to do that, they can just become something else. They don't have to become doctors. And here I'm thinking, well, that's not really freedom of occupational choice, because it's not true that jobs are interchangeable. It's not true that, you wanted to be a doctor because you really care about people and you have a scientific interest, and so this is what you choose to realize yourself. You can't say, I can't be a doctor, well, I'll be an engineer. That's not an equivalent context of choice, right? You're borrowing people from one way of being the person that you want to be, and it's the most important way. So I'm very critical of that. The second thing I'm thinking is his idea that consent kind of gets us out of this problem that we have with coercion is again not plausible, because remember, the state is only allowed to intervene in your basic liberties unless it protects your basic liberties. And here I want to say, well, freedom of occupational choice is a basic liberty, it's a basic right? And what people often forget is that giving consent is not sufficient. It's not working because very often what we say when it's a basic right, it's an inalienable right. So even if you give consent, it doesn't mean anything. You're still not giving up your right, because the whole nature of inalienable rights is that you can't give them up, right? So it's like your right to life. It's very difficult to give that up. I have other things to say in the paper, but I'm going to stop here because I want to know your questions much more than hear me talk. Thank you.